Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dr. Flux, and this is General Psychology. Over the last few lectures, we've explored how our thoughts and behaviors are shaped by the world around us, from the attitudes we form to the social biases that influence our actions. But today, we're shifting gears to explore something even deeper: how we develop over time. We'll look at how psychologists study development, the role genetics play, and even what's happening inside the womb long before we take our first breath. But first, let's make sure we're still sharp on what we covered in the last module. Here are 2 quick review questions. Which of the following is an example of cognitive dissonance? A. Enjoying an activity that conflicts with your personal beliefs. B. Ignoring a contradiction in your values. C. Feeling happy after making a difficult choice. Or D. Changing your behavior without changing your beliefs. If you picked A, you've got it. Cognitive dissonance is that uncomfortable feeling when our actions don't line up with our beliefs, and we're motivated to fix the gap. Let's do another one. What is the fundamental attribution error? A. Overestimating the role of the situation in others' behavior. B. Attributing personal successes to external factors. C. Underestimating the role of personal traits in others' behavior. Or D. Overestimating personal traits while underestimating situational factors in others' behavior. If you chose D, you're spot on. The fundamental attribution error is all about overcrediting personal traits and downplaying the situation when judging others. Now let's jump into today's topic: approaches to understanding development. Think back to your earliest memory. Maybe it's a birthday party, a family trip, or even the scent of your childhood home. Your development started long before that moment, before you were even born, inside the womb. Today, we'll explore how psychologists approach understanding. Here's how we're breaking it down. We'll first start by discussing methods in studying development. We'll take a look at how researchers track human growth over time, whether by comparing age groups or following individuals across their lifespan. We'll then discuss the role of genetics. How much of who we are is written in our DNA? We'll explore the nature versus nurture debate and how genes interact with our environment. Then we'll discuss development inside versus outside of the womb. From hearing your mother's voice to tasting her favorite foods before birth, we'll be exploring the fascinating world of fetal psychology. Then we'll wrap up with our conclusion and a bit of review. By the end of today's lecture, you'll have a better understanding of how psychologists study development, how our genes and environment interact to shape who we become, and how we develop from before birth to after. So let's kick things off by asking a simple question. How do we study development? We all grow and change throughout life, but capturing that process scientifically, that can be quite a challenge. Psychologists have developed several methods to study how we change over time, and today we'll focus on 2 of the most important ones: cross-sectional and longitudinal research design. Now, we've discussed these study designs before in the context of our research methods module, but let's take a closer look at how they can shape our understanding of human development. First up, we have cross-sectional design. This method involves comparing different groups of people at one single time point. Imagine you wanted to study how memory changes with age. You could gather a group of 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and 60-year-olds, give them the same memory test, and then compare the results. That's a cross-sectional study, a quick snapshot of different age groups to spot patterns. It's fast and efficient, but there's a catch. The differences you find might not be due to development. They could be due to something called cohort effects. Cohort effects are when different groups of people may have had different experiences based off of when they were alive or the context in which they lived. This can complicate how we interpret developmental findings. For example, maybe the 60-year-olds didn't grow up with the same access to education or technology as the younger groups, and maybe that's what affects their performance most, not aging itself. To get around cohort effects, scientists will often make use of longitudinal study designs. Instead of comparing different groups, this method follows the same group of people over a long period of time. So if you wanted to study how memory changes with age, you'd start with a group of 20-year-olds, test their memory, and then come back to test them again at 40, at 60, and maybe even beyond. This method gives us a clearer picture of how individuals change over time, but it has its own challenges. Longitudinal studies can take decades, and people might drop out along the way, a problem known as attrition. Plus, they can be expensive and time-consuming. This can be challenging based off of how much research funding is available. But some insights can only be discovered through these methods, making it worth the challenges. One of the most famous longitudinal studies is the Grant Study, which followed a group of Harvard men for over 75 years to explore what factors contributed to a happy, successful life. The study began in 1938 during the Great Depression and followed 268 Harvard sophomores across their entire lives. It included, among many others, eventual President John F. Kennedy and longtime editor of the Washington Post, Ben Bradley. Few of the original cohort are still alive, but the study was expanded to include their children as well. One of the most consistent findings is that relationships matter more than wealth, fame, or even health. The people who had strong supportive relationships were happier and lived longer than those who didn't. This is the benefit of longitudinal study design. Without longitudinal design, we wouldn't have been able to see those deep, long-term patterns. Let's do an attention check. Which of the following best describes a longitudinal study? A. Comparing memory skills of 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and 60-year-olds at the same time. B. Studying a group of people from childhood to adulthood over 30 years. C. Measuring how people respond to a new medication after 1 month. D. Observing how different cultures raise children in a single year. If you picked B, you've got it. A longitudinal study tracks the same group over time to see how they change. The other options describe cross-sectional or other short-term research designs. Now that we've explored how psychologists study development, let's tackle one of the biggest questions in psychology. What shapes who we are? Are we born with certain traits and behaviors hardwired into our DNA? Or are we shaped entirely by our environment and experiences? This brings us to that classic debate of nature versus nurture, a question that's been at the heart of psychology for over a century. When we talk about nature, we're referring to our genetics, the traits and characteristics that we inherit from our biological parents. Things like eye color, height, and even some aspects of personality and intelligence can have a genetic basis. On the other hand, nurture refers to our environment, the experiences, relationships, and cultural influences that shape us over time. For a long time, psychologists tried to figure out whether nature or nurture had a bigger impact on development. But today, we know the answer isn't so simple. It's not either or, it's both and. One of the most fascinating discoveries in developmental psychology is that our genes and environment don't just operate separately, they interact in complex ways. For example, you might have a genetic predisposition for a trait, like being more extroverted or a tendency towards anxiety, but whether that trait actually develops can depend on your environment. Let's say someone has a genetic risk for anxiety. If they grow up in a supportive, nurturing environment, that risk might never materialize. But in a stressful or chaotic upbringing, it could be triggered. This is known as gene by environment interaction, and it shows just how dynamic development really is. Let's look at a fascinating study that shows how biology and environment can work together in surprising ways. In a 2004 study, researchers Sudo and colleagues found that early exposure to microbes, yes, the tiny bacteria that we usually think of as bad, is actually crucial for healthy development of our stress response systems, particularly one known as the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic, pituitary, and adrenal axis. In the study, mice that were raised in sterile environments without exposure to microbes had overactive stress responses later in life. But when those same mice were exposed to microbes early on, their stress responses were more balanced. The study highlights how genetic systems, like the stress response, need environmental input to develop properly. It's not just about what's in our DNA, but also about how our environment activates and shapes that genetic blueprint. In this case, we evolved to require specific types of inputs from microbes to properly develop our stress systems over time. Without that input, we may lose resilience. This is an example of gene by environment interactions at work. Let's reflect and bring this closer to home. Think about a trait or a behavior you have. Maybe it's your sense of humor, your athletic ability, or your love of reading. Do you think that trait is something you were born with? Or do you think it was shaped by your environment, like the people around you or the experiences that you've had? Chances are it's a little both. Our development is a dance between genes and environment, each influencing the other in ways that we're still discovering. So far, we've explored how psychologists study development and how our genes and environment shape who we become. But what about before we're even born? What's happening inside the womb that influences our development long before we take our first breath? When we think about development, we usually imagine milestones like a baby's first step, a child's first day at school, or even learning to drive as a teenager. But what if I told you that development starts long before any of that? Even before you take your first breath, your senses are active and your brain is already learning from the world around you. Welcome to the incredible world of fetal psychology. Fetal psychology is the study of how a fetus develops inside the womb, focusing on how early experiences shape the brain, body, and behavior even before birth. It might sound surprising, but fetuses are far from passive. They're sensing and processing things from the outside world. Let's break down how the senses develop in the womb and how these early experiences lay the groundwork for life after birth. By around 18 weeks, fetuses start to respond to sound. By the third trimester, they can recognize familiar voices, especially their mother's. Research shows that newborns prefer their mother's voice over others, and can even recognize stories that they heard repeatedly in the womb. The flavor of food that a mother eats is transmitted through the amniotic fluid. So if a person eats a lot of garlic or carrots during pregnancy, the baby becomes familiar with those tastes. After birth, babies often show a preference for foods they were exposed to in the womb. By the second trimester, fetuses start moving around, exploring their environment by touching their face, grabbing the umbilical cord, and even walking against the uterine wall. Vision is the last sense to develop. While the womb is a dark place, some light can penetrate, and fetuses may respond to bright lights shown on the mother's belly. A fascinating finding illustrating that learning can occur during fetal development comes from a study by DeCasper and Spence out of the University of North Carolina at Greensboro in 1986. In this study, pregnant mothers read the story The Cat in the Hat aloud every day during the last 6 weeks of pregnancy. Soon after the babies were born, at about 3 days old, researchers played recordings of the mother reading The Cat in the Hat and another story that the infant would not have been familiar with. DeCasper and his colleagues had developed a device that measured the frequency of sucking on an artificial nipple, and learned that babies will suck faster when exposed to familiar stimuli. In this experiment, the newborns showed a clear preference when they heard their mother reading The Cat in the Hat. This preference for the familiar story demonstrated recognition of the rhythm and sounds that they had been exposed to during their time in the womb. It suggests that learning begins before birth, and that sounds, voices, and rhythms we're exposed to in the womb can shape our early experiences and learning. While development inside the womb is crucial, the period right after birth, sometimes called the fourth trimester, is just as important. During this time, babies are adjusting to life outside of the womb, but they're still relying on familiar cues like their mother's voice, heartbeat, and even certain smells and tastes that they experienced before birth. In this fourth trimester, one of the most important things to understand is how immature the newborn's nervous system still is. Even though the baby is now outside of the womb, many of the systems that regulate things like sleep, digestion, and emotional responses are still developing. That's one of the reasons why newborns seem so unpredictable, crying one moment, sleeping the next, and sometimes being startled for no clear reason. What they're doing, neurologically speaking, is calibrating. They're trying to figure out what input matters, what brings comfort, and what predicts stability. A big part of this calibration process comes from co-regulation with caregivers. When a parent picks up a crying infant and holds them close, the baby doesn't just feel soothed emotionally, there are actual physiological changes happening. Heart rate slows, cortisol levels drop. Even brainwave activity begins to shift toward more regulated patterns. These aren't just cute bonding moments, they are biologically essential. The body is learning. This is what calm feels like. This is what safety feels like. During this fourth trimester, the range of familiar voices and faces starts to grow, and those early interactions with caregivers become the building blocks for trust, empathy, and emotional resilience later in life. This period is all about building connection, both with caregivers and the environment, which lays the foundation for attachment and emotional development, which we'll be getting into in future lectures. Let's do an attention check. Which of the following is the last sense to develop in the womb? Is it A, hearing, B, taste, C, touch, or D, vision? If you picked D, vision, you're right. Vision is the last sense to develop because the womb is a dark place with limited light exposure. Interestingly, vision also continues to develop after birth until around age 6 or 7. Meanwhile, senses like hearing, taste, and touch are already hard at work before birth. All right, let's bring everything together. Today we explored how psychologists study development, how genetics and environment interact to shape who we are, and even how life in the womb is filled with experiences that influence our growth. From the methods researchers use to track development over time to the sensory world of the fetus, we've seen that development is a complex, dynamic process that starts long before birth and continues throughout life. Here's some key ideas I want you to walk away with from today's lecture. Psychologists use cross-sectional and longitudinal designs to study how people change over time. Cross-sectional studies compare different age groups at one time, while longitudinal studies follow the same individuals across years or even decades. Our development is shaped both by nature, our genetics, and nurture, our environment. Traits like intelligence or temperament might have a genetic basis, but they're influenced by life experiences through gene-by-environment interactions. Fetuses begin to experience the world before birth, responding to sounds, flavors, and even light. Experiments like DeCasper and Spence's Cat in the Hat study show that learning starts before we take our first breath, and even after birth, in the so-called fourth trimester, development continues. Let's reinforce today's material with a couple of review questions. Which research method follows the same group of individuals over time? Is it A, cross-sectional, B, longitudinal, C, experimental, or D, a case study? If you picked B, you're spot on. Longitudinal studies follow the same people over time to see how they develop and change. What does fetal psychology suggest about learning in the womb? A, fetuses can only react to loud noises but not learn from them. B, fetuses can distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar voices. C, fetuses cannot form memories until after birth. D, learning begins only after sensory development is complete. If you chose B, you've got it. Fetuses can recognize familiar voices, rhythms, and even stories heard repeatedly in the womb. Development isn't a destination. It's a rhythm, a dialogue between biology and experience, between what's written in our genes and what unfolds in our environments. And it takes a tremendous amount of work and intention to study it in ways that are empirical and valid. We often imagine growth as a straight line, but today's material reminds us it can diverge in many ways. It begins before memory, shaped by stories told in cells and whispers from the womb. Genes offer blueprints, but it's experience that sculpts who we become. There is no single path, only a constant unfolding. So next time you wonder how someone became who they are, or how you came to be who you are, remember, the answer lies somewhere between nature and nurture, and we gain clarity through multiple lenses and approaches. Just like our quote, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Thanks for sticking with me today. As always, stay curious, stay resilient, and above all, live life in flux. I'll see you in the next lecture.